Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Welsh Athletics webinar series. I'm going to be taking you through today's session on the fundamentals of the Javelin Throw. I'm David Turner. I'm the England Athletics talent lead for Javelin and also the head throws coach at Loughborough University. There's a little bit about me. Hopefully everyone can see my webcam, which I've left turned on just so you can see me. I think it makes life a little bit easier if I do that. So the background for me is that originally I'm from Blackpool and I moved back to Loughborough University where I studied back down in 2015. Now the head throws coach there, coordinating all of the throws from Loughborough, but focusing specifically on the javelin throw. And my Welsh connection for you tonight is being coached to the Welsh Paralympic and Commonwealth champion, Hollie Arnold. So it was a privilege for me to be part of the Welsh team at the Commonwealth Games in 2018 over in the Gold Coast, where thankfully Hollie managed to win in the last round, but made my life very stressful that evening. So the purpose of the session today is, first thing I've been asked to do is to recap the pull throw and training equipment required for that. Secondly, to explain the key phases of the javelin throw, explain the key training methods that coaches and athletes might wish to pursue with the javelin throw, and finally to offer coaches, parents and hopefully athletes as well today a question and answers opportunity at the end of the session as well. So the first thing I wanted to talk about really is how do we get kids hooked onto the javelin throw? And the first thing I would say is that look, kids really, they love to throw. So it's really important that we let them throw. Athletics needs to be more than just run and indeed run and jump. It needs to be run, jump and throw. One of the key things that I like to explain to people when we're talking about why maybe some people aren't as confident with throwing is a term that we use called can't catch, won't throw. So many sports, of course, require a catch and a throw element to them, but there is a lot of research out there that suggests that when someone hasn't been involved in sports that require catching and throwing, let's say cricket might be a good example of that, or baseball, softball, those type of sports, it actually, if you're not comfortable catching, you're much less likely to be comfortable throwing. So really important to play catch, do those kind of things that we'd expect with youngsters if we're hoping for them to go on and do athletics and do a throw such as the very technically sophisticated javelin throw and pull throw technique later on. So as many opportunities for kids to throw different things, different equipment as possible. And one thing I did think it's really important to say is it doesn't just have to be javelin. So balls, tennis balls, the British #1 at the moment in javelin in the ladies side, Becca, who's a girl that I coach, she, first time I saw her, she was throwing dog balls from one end of a javelin runway to the other end at 15 years old. And I thought, blimey, that's a bit of a talent there. So making sure that people have the opportunity to throw all those different types of things is hugely important. And if you've come across them before, vortex howlers are a good tool you can use, foam javelins that people use in sports hall athletics, and there's different types of plastic javelins as well. You might have heard of some of them, such as turbo javs and fin flyers. They're all really good equipment that's, to be honest with you, a lot safer than throwing a normal javelin, let's say in a park or on a beach when you go away for a holiday. So encouraging people to throw as much as possible, I think, is one of the most important things we can say. However, what I would say is, as coaches or as parents, try and focus wherever possible on the keeping it safe rather than over coaching. And by keeping it safe, I really don't just mean there the fact that javelin is essentially a weapon and it's got two pointy ends to it. What I actually mean by that is focus on the important aspects of the technique, and I'll cover those a little bit later on when we discuss rotation of the shoulder and how we keep the elbow and the shoulder safe with the throw. But really important just to say that let kids have fun, let them play, experiment. You don't have to overcoach when youngsters are throwing the pull throw and indeed the other throws from a young age. So one of the challenges we'll tend to find is when we move somebody from a ball throw or maybe a foam javelin into throwing the real javelin itself. And my tips for that really are, first of all, that you have to understand what the pull throw is. So with all throws, we're looking at sequencing, first of all, starting with the legs, then moving on to the hips and the trunk, through onto the arm. Or the way that I like to think about it is the big stuff works first and then the little stuff. And of course, the littlest of stuff is that throwing hand at the very end, which delivers the implement. What I try and get athletes to do is accept that javelin isn't a throw. And that might sound like I'm contradicting myself. I've talked about the javelin throw and understanding the pull throw, but essentially I want you to think about an elastic band. So cast your mind back to when you were at school. If you took an elastic band, you pull that elastic band as far back as you could, and when you wanted to fire it at somebody, ideally not the teacher, you wouldn't throw the elastic band, you would just let go. And javelin is exactly the same, where you're essentially trying to take that elastic band as far back as you can, and then not thinking, blimey, I need to put lots of effort in to throw this. I'm just in a position where I will naturally let go, and that will generate more release velocity than trying to throw the javelin with lots of upper body arm effort. And I've got some diagrams in a moment to explain what I mean by external rotation of the shoulder, which is absolutely key to being able to deliver the javelin safely and effectively. The next thing I've put as well here is that girls and indeed boys just want to have fun. So quite simply, what I'm looking for here is for coaches to accept that with youngsters, the first thing they want to do is maybe scratch that itch of getting out there, having a throw, and then maybe once we've scratched that itch, let them have a few throws. Then we move on to discussing some of the technical aspects. If you're running a session and you're spending the first 30 minutes only covering standing throws with a ball, not moving on to actually having some of the fun elements to throwing a javelin, then that is maybe where you could look at your session and think, okay, can I get the fun part? Can I get that excitement through the whole session? So a good thing that you can do there is lots of walking throws with a javelin where they might be aiming at a cone. One of my friends, Kelly, she spends a lot of time having athletes throw at balloons. If they hit the balloon, it explodes. Sometimes I think she even puts things in the balloon as prizes. So that's not just for fun purposes, of course, but also when you're aiming at a particular target, you can set things at 10 meters, 15, 20, and you can have a real focus then on can they keep control of the javelin, lining that javelin up. Because one of the most difficult things to do for a young person is to move from throwing a ball, which is of course just a round implement that fits in somebody's hand, compared to a javelin, which can be 2 meters plus long. And it's really the length of the javelin, not the weight of the javelin, that makes it such a challenging event. The next thing I put is that I call this, doesn't that candy cane look cool? So I'm sure any of you that are familiar with going to athletics competitions will see some really cool javelins out there. You'll see the ones with the spirals, you'll see ones with really cool paint jobs with fluorescent colors, loads of different types of javelins that are out there. But what I would say is when we are moving from throwing balls from junior plastic javelins, foam javelins into the real thing, don't rush to get a really expensive javelin for a young person. So the more expensive javelins, they tend to be stiffer, potentially made out of steel, aluminium, or for the really top end javelins, often carbon or some kind of a composite metal components. And with that, they are much, much stiffer than a beginner's javelin. The problem with that is that the risk of injury and soreness due to those stiffer javelins is much higher. So I'd always recommend trying to throw a javelin that is appropriate to that athlete's level of capability. Some javelins, they have a distance rating on the side of them, let's say 70 meters or 80 meters, and some of them will have a stiffness rating. So with the distance rating, if you have a young developing girl throwing a 500-gram javelin, maybe throwing that 30 meters, you're looking for a distance rating somewhere around a 40-meter javelin, sounds fine. However, if you've got a young man who's maybe moved up to the 800-gram javelin, they're throwing 60 meters, a 70, 80-meter javelin, that's kind of okay then, but it's certainly, I wouldn't be putting that same javelin in the hand of a beginner that's throwing 30 or 40 meters. So really careful to make sure we match the javelin to the athlete and we don't end up making them too stiff and too sore in their shoulder and elbow. And then the final thing to say as well around challenges is what I call, but I saw it on YouTube. And I'm sure any of the coaches on the call today will be very much familiar with the fact that when we have a javelin, that we see a javelin thrower that's on social media, and maybe they've seen Johannes Vetter or Thomas Roller or potentially somebody like Sarah Kolak from the female perspective on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and you might say, oh, but they're doing this and they're doing that, so I should copy that. But it's very important to understand as coaches and indeed as athletes, we need to match the technique up to the individual. So I certainly wouldn't recommend just copying somebody's technique or style based on what we've seen on the internet. And of course, everybody is different. Every person is a different size, a different body shape, and we have to take these things into account. And also, as I've got a good friend called Gary, who's a discus coach, he often talks about how when he was younger, he finally met one of his heroes in the discus, and he said, oh, that thing that you've been doing in the middle of your throw, I absolutely love that. I've been trying to copy that all my life. And that famous athlete turned around to him and said, I've been trying to stop doing that my whole life. So never just copy something that you see on the internet because you think it might be a good idea. Always be very, very clear on why the coach is doing what they're doing. And in most of the videos I'm going to show you today, I'm going to use the women's world champion, Kelsey Lee Barber, as my example, mostly because I'm good friends with her coach and he's explained to me exactly what they're working on. So I'm able to explain that I feel better than just choosing other athletes who I maybe know less about. So I promised I'd talk about external rotation of the shoulder, and this is absolutely key to the javelin throw. So first thing to say around this is the elbow will need to bend and come away from the head to throw a javelin correctly. A lot of people might not be aware of that. Indeed, to protect the arm and the elbow, people have often been told in the past that you keep it really high and have it brush past the ear. And you know what, when you're working with real youngsters and just trying to get them to throw for the first time, they maybe had a very low arm, that's okay. But when we move on to the talent area, we have to really then start to understand that we need that elbow to come away from the body. It's perfectly safe to do so as long as the elbow is at least as high as the shoulder. So that's what I would always recommend. And then to deliver or throw the javelin, you see the picture here of Goldie Sayers. In fact, you'll see that where her elbow is bent and her shoulder is rotated back. Now, when she delivers the javelin, she won't just be straightening her arm and letting go above her head. She'll be actually pulling on through that javelin for as long as she can and trying to release somewhere where her hand will be roughly above her front toes. I've got a couple more pictures for you here to illustrate this point. There's a nice overhead picture there that I really like of that position of Goldie, where her front foot has just made contact with the ground. Her left shoulder is still almost square to the direction of throw. And you'll see that her elbow is about to come away from the body, but stay high. And there's a picture of the 2015 men's world champion, Julius Jago. You'll see how his elbow is about as far away from his head as is possible, but you'll see that the hand and the elbow are above shoulder height, and therefore we know that that is going to be relatively well protected. So one of the things I wanted to discuss was around essential training for the event. How do we instill some of these technical elements before we go on to throwing the real javelin itself? Well, I think ball throwing is one of the key ways to do this, and I do have some tips. So first of all, the reason I love ball throwing is because it does reduce the injury risk. There's much less load going through the body with a weighted ball throw. I tend to vary the weight quite often. However, if you're working with beginners, I would probably say keep to within either 100 grams above or below their competition weight to begin with. And then when they develop in strength, experience, and technical competence, you can then start to expand some of those. So with let's say, an international level female javelin thrower, some of the ball throws she would do might be 1 kilo, even perhaps 1.2 kilos in the depths of winter off a very short approach, such as a walking throw or a standing throw. And that might move to 400 grams or even less off a run up when it comes to competition season, when we'll be looking more at speed. It's easier to do ball throwing indoors than it is to throw a real life javelin, you see. So I think that's a great tool that coaches can use to be able to do more throwing and develop more volume safely with young athletes. because of course we don't, in many parts of the UK, have the opportunity to be able to throw javelins indoors. So when the weather's terrible, really good opportunity to get inside or get some shelter, find a wall that's safe to throw a ball against. And the other reason I've put this in as being so important for coaches to be out there doing is because, quite simply, it's easier and safer for coaching larger groups with balls, so you can work with more athletes at a time. And I know that coaches that are working with relatively large numbers in club athletics, that's a really important aspect, because what we don't want to do is have, let's say, 10 throwers only getting 5 throws during a whole session because you've got that many athletes to work with. So I've got together for you now a demonstration of some ball throw exercises. These are in order of difficulty, so begin with the easiest first, and then we move on through to the most advanced. And this is all together in one video. I'll explain which each of them are in a moment, but I'll be quiet first and just let you watch this particular set of throws. So I'll show you that video again in a moment, but let me explain what you've just seen. So first of all, a standing throw, standing side on, weight on the back leg and delivering the throw. Progressing that into a 3-stride walking throw, followed by a 3-stride walking throw with a runoff. Me personally, I'm not a big fan of doing lots and lots of walking throws. I prefer to put a runoff, or what you may have heard as an impulse stride, into that, because it makes sure that the front leg is out where we want it to be, ready to take the body weight when the javelin thrower blocks. If you're not familiar with the terms runoff or impulse stride, don't worry, because we're going to cover those in a moment. Then we moved on to a hopping throw. I'm a big fan of the hopping throw because, quite simply, if you're hopping, you're on one leg. And as a javelin thrower, that means we should be on our back leg. And that's a really good opportunity for us to work on being able to rotate the back foot and hip to put the front leg down. And then finally, a crossovers throw, where it would be similar to what you might do with the javelin itself. So I'll just show you those throws again in case you're not familiar with them. There we go. And for any javelin aficionados amongst you interested in what she was working on there, she was actually working on keeping her arm back and feeling stretch across the chest whilst trying to land on her back leg by minimizing how much flexion or bend she was having on her back leg when she landed, so she was able to control her body weight into her block. So I've got a few tips around what we do with the pull throw. I've already said to think of the elastic band. Another analogy some people use is think of it as a bow and arrow. So you're taking that bow back and then you don't throw the arrow, you just let the bow do the work. It's important to remember that the release speed of the javelin is critical to the distance. So as with all of the throws, the faster the javelin leaves the hand, the further it is going to go. And that's the most critical factor in determining how far the javelin goes. Now, the longer the pull length, the greater the release speed. So the longer that the athlete is able to pull along the length of the javelin for, in theory, the greater that release speed should be. And with javelin, we tend to think about the pull generating 2/3 of the release speed and the run-up itself generating about 1/3. And I always say that run-up should be faster towards the end. They should minimize deceleration between the run-up and plant phases. And then throwers should decelerate rapidly at the front foot plant. And again, if you're not familiar with the terms run-off and plant, don't worry, because that's what we're going to discuss in a moment. So as I go through some of the technical aspects now, just a few key terminology points to point out for you. COM, first of all, that means center of mass, if you see that. DOT just means direction of throw. You may see me use the term athletic stiffness. And the way I like to think about that is, if you were going to jump off a box, you wouldn't land with your legs rigid and stiff and completely extended. You land with a little bit of bend in your knees, but still trying to land with some stiffness when you do land. So that's what I think about as athletic stiffness. And then minimizing any sinking once we have landed. And then finally, I might use the term angle of attack, which, don't worry again if you're not familiar with that, because I've got a diagram to illustrate what we mean in terms of the correct angles for throwing the javelin. So the first phase, we call this the carry, and define that as the phase of the run-up where the thrower runs with the chest forward and the javelin not withdrawn. So hopefully everyone's familiar with this. I've got a little example for you here of this was actually the winning throw at the World Championships last year. And you'll see just running forward towards the direction of throw before the javelin thrower moves side on. And the characteristics I'm looking for there is the head and the trunk are facing forwards towards the direction of throw. The javelin tip will be level or slightly down and facing towards the direction of throw, with the shoulders nice and relaxed. And in terms of the bottom half, I'm looking for a ball of the foot contact with nice athletically stiff ankles and knees. I must go back and let you watch that one more time. Now, before we move on, it's important to remember that when we start with beginners, we don't need to rush into moving them to throwing off a full run-up that includes a carry phase. Quite simply, just working from crossovers only is absolutely fine. In fact, I would highly recommend it. And with some heptathletes or decathletes even, they always keep to just crossovers. So that's something to bear in mind, that you don't have to rush people to that type of throwing, certainly not before they're ready and before they can cope with the increased speed and demand of the event. Phase 2 is what we call the crossovers, or you may have heard this called the acyclical phase. So this is the phase of the run-up where the javelin thrower is running sideways with the javelin withdrawn, i.e. the arm will be fully extended, and that will be usually for 5 or 7 strides. Here's an example of that. Again, this time a training throw from Kelsey. And we'll come back into that in a moment when I explain to you the key components of that phase. So you'll see the head and sight line, they remain towards the direction of throw, but now the trunk, i.e. the athlete's chest, is side on 90 degrees, facing towards where that person was, of course, filming. And that enables the javelin thrower to increase their potential length of pull on the javelin. So the shoulders will be side on and level. We won't be looking to have the javelin thrower tilt their arm downwards, because that would create angles that wouldn't be positive for javelin throwing. The throwing arm will be extended with the hand just above shoulder height and the throwing palm facing up towards the sky. In the bottom half, we're looking for athletically stiff ankles and knees again, hips level with the front foot ground contact just in front of the front hip, and the back leg knee remains over the ankle in midair. And that's crucial because we don't want the foot to get too far ahead of the knee, because when that happens, we tend to change the center of mass at the point of landing. So I'll show you that one more time. And hopefully you'll see some of those key characteristics there in terms of where the athlete is looking, the arm being fully withdrawn, the hips nice and level, and really nice ground contact there with the feet, and control of the right foot and knee as the athlete runs. The next phase we call the run-off, and you may also know this as the impulse stride. And I've defined this as the period between the penultimate front foot contact to landing on the final back foot contact. So essentially, this is that little jump in the air that the athletes do. And the reason they do this is to, first of all, give themselves some time to set their legs, but secondly, to make sure they are landing with their center of mass in the correct position to be able to maximize the power and pull generated for the javelin throw. Let you have a look at this phase, very short video, this one. And again. One more time. So let's have a look at some of the key characteristics of this phase and then come back to look at it again. So we like to think of the trunk as being offset behind the center of mass by 5 to 10 degrees. So what that means is that with a right-handed thrower, their right shoulder should be just a bit further back of their right hip. The throwing arm remains fully withdrawn with the hand level or above the right shoulder, and the left arm remains relaxed and does not extend. So you'll see when Kelsey is landing on her back leg, the left arm is still across her. And then the back foot lands between 45 and 90 degrees to the direction of throw, the knee slightly bent. The back foot, knee and hip will all land aligned, so stacked on top of each other. The hips will still be at roughly 90 degrees to the direction of throw, and then the left leg will be ahead of the back leg at back foot contact. Let's have a look at some of those aspects. So here you'll see Kelsey's looking towards the direction of throw. It may look as though her hand has dropped, but it hasn't. It's just because the right shoulder is slightly back from the right hip. When she's landing, there is a little bit of flexion in that back leg. That's what I call that athletically stiff position. You will see her left leg is ahead of her right leg. So that's going to minimize the amount of time it then takes for the front leg to hit the ground. And then finally, her trunk and her chest are still side on, with her left arm still across her. And she's poised in a really good position there to throw that javelin a long way. And then I've actually combined phases 4 and 5, which are the plant and delivery. So the way that I've defined this is the point between final back foot contact, final full foot contact, followed by the throw and release itself. And if I put these two together into one video here, so we begin with the athlete where they finish the run-off phase, hitting through to the end of the plant phase, and then delivering the javelin. Now you'll probably see with Kelsey's javelin there, that's going a little bit too high. She's losing the point of the javelin a little bit there. But I really like this video because it shows really good leg work. And one of the things you'll probably know about Kelsey, and certainly her and a coach are working on, is trying to just improve those flight dynamics of her javelin throw. So again, similar to what I said about watching and understanding what you see on YouTube, don't just copy it blindly. Don't look at that and think that javelin angle is something that you're going to deliberately copy. That's the one thing I would say about this. So there we have the end of that plant phase. You'll see we've got that really nice balance between right and left leg. Her left shoulder still facing towards the direction of throw, arm fully extended. And as I said, in an ideal world, I'd like to see that javelin just changed in her wrist a little bit so that the javelin is still touching her head. And then the delivery, nice and strong on the front leg here in a moment, and rotating those hips into the throw for as long as possible and releasing out in front of her. So characteristics of those phases. First of all, the plant phase, Head and sight line remain towards direction of throw. You see in a bit of a pattern emerged there, that every single section was still trying to make sure that head and sight line remained towards the direction of throw. The trunk remains side on, and that's where we have that separation between what the legs are doing and the hips and what the top half is doing. The throwing half arm remains fully extended. Throwing hand remains relaxed with the elbow level to or just above shoulder height. And then we see an active use of the left arm to create a stretch across the chest. I call that a stretch reflex. So again, that's another example of how I'm trying to encourage athletes to, rather than think about throwing with the throwing arm, instead you're creating a stretch, you're creating that elasticity and letting the throw happen naturally much faster. With the bottom half, we'll be looking at the center of mass to be balanced between the back and the front leg. An active back foot internally rotates the hip towards the direction of throw, and the front leg tries not to bend. Let's watch that one more time to catch that aspect. And then the components of the delivery phase. Again, the head and sight line remain focused on the direction of throw. I would always recommend telling the athlete to pick something to look at, whatever stadium, whatever track it is they're throwing at, and keep looking at that straight ahead of them, but not too high throughout the throw. Looking at the neighboring high jump bed across the other side of the track is usually a good idea if you have one. The chest expands whilst the trunk resists flexion. All that's really saying is the chest becomes as big as possible. Try and think about if you've maybe got an athlete with a logo on their t-shirt, trying to make the logo as big as possible. And then by resisting flexion, all that means is that we're trying to not bend forward. Throwing hand over the back foot. So that's maximizing how much potential pull is possible at the start of this phase. And then we move into external rotation, where, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, you'll see the elbow move away from the body. And as long as we keep it at least at shoulder height, we know that we're going to be okay. And then the release point is in front of the athlete, ideally over the toes of that front foot, and an angle of attack of between 6 and 2 degrees. I'll explain angle of attack in a moment. With the bottom half, we're looking at the back foot still in contact with the ground, with the back knee bent. If the back knee isn't bent, i.e. the back leg is fully extended, that tends to move the trunk too far forward. We want to avoid bending the front leg more than 160 degrees. So what I'm looking for there is minimal flexion of that front leg, nice and strong, so the energy is transferred into the throw. And then finally, the hips rotate to at least 0 degrees to the direction of throw, and hips remain solid. So what we mean by that is that when we're rotating the hips forward towards the direction of throw, we want the javelin thrower to get as much hip strike into the throw as possible. With a really, really good athlete, you might see that if we think about a clock face, that an athlete would actually move their hips all the way through to about 11:30 on the clock face. So they're really staying in contact with that javelin as long as possible. And you'll probably see that with Kelsey. If I just go back and show you this video one more time, maybe two. They're really rotating those hips into the throw and driving up over the top. I use the term active use of the left arm, and I think this is one of the major mistakes we make in the UK. What you'll see is Kelsey takes the arm out. She's keeping it internally rotated, i.e. looking at her watch for as long as possible, is a cue that sometimes people will use. And then once that front leg is down, then using the arm as fast as she possibly can to strike the javelin. Hold, and then she goes. So that active use of the left arm is something that I think is really important. The alternative to that will be the passive use of the arm, where the athlete just brings it across them during the runoff and then never attempts to use that properly. The reason I'm not a fan of that is because it tends to encourage javelin throwers either to hurt themselves or to not give themselves enough room to deliver the javelin, so they have to let go of it above their head. I promised I'd talk about the angle of attack so that athletes and coaches are able to understand what we mean by the correct aerodynamic aspects of the javelin throw. So here, the first thing we need to do is calculate the release angle, and that's calculated from the path of the javelin's center of gravity. So if you see here in the diagram that we have a blue dot which represents the center of mass, or the middle of the javelin weight, and that's usually somewhere on the grip of the javelin. So we calculate the path of the javelin at that point to create an angle that we can use as a measure of release angle. Usually we'd prefer that to be somewhere around 36 to 40 degrees with a javelin throw. And then we are able to take that and measure the angle of attack, which is the difference between the javelin at the center of gravity through to where the tip of the javelin is measured from at any point. So you'll see there's a line there where it says angle of attack, and between the line generated from the center of gravity. And that difference there is crucial to being able to determine what the angle of attack is for the javelin. And we're looking to minimize how big that angle of attack is, because that enables the javelin to fly aerodynamically through the air. Important to remember that the javelin is an aerodynamic implement, and that is why the release angle is between 36 up to 40 degrees, not 45 degrees, which you may have thought it was. As my friend used to say, that 45 degrees is the perfect angle for a house brick, and the javelin is certainly not a house brick. So please do remember that what you want to see is just a dot in the sky as you release the javelin. And if you play around with the javelin and just have a look at messing around with those angles and see when that dot happens, the javelin's a lot flatter than at 45 degrees, and that's what you're looking for. So on to some essential training for the event, and I'm a big fan of medicine balls. I think they're a really good tool that most people can use nicely and safely, and usually someone has some area or somebody they can throw a medicine ball to. They're great because they can be used for general or throw specific or even event specific exercises. And essentially what you're able to do with them is pretty much unlimited. They give you an opportunity to develop power, potentially strength with a heavier ball, or even speed with a lighter ball. And we can vary how we're using medicine balls, which weights we're using, even for the same exercise, but at different types of the year by using different weights, whether that be anything from, I would recommend having in your locker, so to speak, everything from a 1 kilo medicine ball up to at least a 4 kilo medicine ball as a coach or as an athlete. And as I said, you could have the same exercise where you were using a 4K at one time of the year, which moves down to a 1K at a different time of the year. Of course, we would then tend to think of using the speed-based activities towards the athletic season itself, because those lighter weights would be closer to the actual weight of a javelin. Always worth remembering, a men's javelin full size only weighs 800 grams, and a lady's javelin only weighs 600 grams. So there isn't the need to be as strong as a shot putter, shall we say. Another reason I'm a big fan of medicine balls is because they help to essentially reduce injury risk, because you're not using the throwing implement as much, and a medicine ball is much easier to handle and to use and to throw safely and effectively than a real javelin. And also that helps the athlete actually develop more volume, more strength, more throwing ability, which increases their technical competency, I would hope, with the proper coaching, and also increases their robustness. So we're going to have much less injury risk if we're throwing medicine balls safely and effectively throughout the year. And I always say that the options are endless with this, and creativity is absolutely legal. So you don't have to just do throws that I recommend or that Ryan recommends or that anybody else that you already know recommends. Come up with your own ideas. I love having world-class athletes come over to where I coach, and they show me new things all the time. And many of them, they've just created themselves to be able to address a particular idea or a particular challenge that they've had as an athlete. So definitely use creativity to come up with your own ideas and indeed your own equipment. And it's worth saying as well that this isn't limited just to medicine balls. I cover everything in a bracket really of physical preparation ideas, from D-balls, which is a one-handed implement. You'll see maybe it looks a lot like a medicine ball but with a handle. You can get them on ropes as well. Power bags are great. I love kettlebells and dumbbells as well. The great strength and conditioning coach Vern Gambetta always says that dumbbells aren't dumb, they're very smart. It's a great opportunity for you to be able to perhaps introduce a snatch to an athlete much easier than it is from using a barbell. So some great opportunities there for you to use medicine balls and other training equipment. I've put a few of my favorite throws together for you in a little video. So I'll show you this now a couple of times. So that was a whistle-stop tour. Let me explain to you what those exercises were, and we'll go through them again. So we had a chest pass, and you can do that lots of different ways. This one is into a wall. You could do it to another person, or you could do it lying on your back with the ball being dropped towards you and then throwing it back up as fast as you can. So slightly more plyometric in that sense. Then we had the lying overhead throw with glute raise. Again, you can do the lying overhead throw many different ways. Another option is to do it without the glute raise, so keeping your back level to the ground. Or another way is to put another medicine ball over your behind your thoracic spine. So you're trying to actually use that particular, usually quite a dense medicine ball, to actually get some more extension over your T-spine. You can do a standing overhead throw. In this video, that was demonstrated with the feet offset, but you can do it with the feet facing forward, shoulder width apart as well if you wish to. And of course, experiment with which foot you're leading with, so we get nice balanced athletes. It doesn't have to always be using the javelin thrower's front block leg. Kneeling overhead throw is another one that I'm a big fan of. Again, it gives us an opportunity just to work on that extension of the thoracic spine. The lunging shot put throw is one that I introduced to my programs a couple of years ago. I like this one because it gives you an opportunity to focus on thoracic rotation, so more ability to work on the thoracic rotation of the back into the throw. Then you've got the standing shot put throw. I'm a big fan of that one because we can really focus on taking the javelin throw aspect out of the throw and instead focusing on trying to stay in contact with the ball as long as possible by striking the hips and rotating them through as far as we can. And thinking about the triple extension of the throwing arm as we're able to do that. And then finally the Schwambeck throw, which hopefully you'll have seen before, but this is starting side on as if we were in a javelin throw position, but throwing the ball two-handed. So it comes back up over the head and we release as far out as we can, focusing on trying to strike the hips forward into the direction of throw and keeping the chest and the hips nice and strong for delivery. You may also wish to experiment with doing that with a D ball as well, because not only can you then work left-handed and right-handed nicely, but you can also then make it slightly more specific to the javelin throw because it becomes a one-handed throw. I'm a big fan of that. I would only use maybe a 1.5 kilo with a female athlete, maybe up to a 2 kilo with a male athlete. At the stage of development that I'm working with athletes, and that way as well it gives us an opportunity to work on encouraging them to just stay relaxed with their throwing shoulder and elbow, working on external rotation and giving them the confidence to allow that elbow to come away from the body like we would see with an elite javelin thrower. Just show you those videos, medicine ball throws one more time. So chest pass, lying overhead throw with glute raise, overhead throw standing with feet offset, kneeling overhead throw, shot put lunge throw, standing shot throw, and the Schwambeck. Medicine ball throwing and ball throwing aren't the only options, of course. There's other key training ideas and options that I think coaches should be putting into their javelin training programs. Plyometric exercises, absolutely key. So by plyometric exercises, I'm thinking here mostly of jumps, hops, bounds, any type of activity that you may be doing, something you could be looking at increasing your ground reactivity time. Box drops, box jumps for stability, single leg work. I'm a big fan of single leg stability in the javelin throw is obviously crucial. So all of those type of plyometric activities, and linked to that as well, you could argue that hurdle drills kind of fit into that. You can use hurdle drills for posture and hip mobility or for foot and ankle conditioning, but you can also use them for plyometrics as well, such as bounding or jumping over them. Sprints, they're important for explosive power and also mastering ground contact. So really important to think there about the dorsiflexion element of when we were teaching an athlete to be able to recycle their leg and land with nice stiff ankles and transfer that energy into the ground, exactly as we would do with a sprint. We'd be thinking about the same technical elements to a javelin thrower's run up. Resistance training, what I've put here is technique, not load. So I'm a big fan of introducing strength training to young people from a young age. Actually, there are a lot of myths about how strength training can affect growth plates and affect physical development and be unhealthy, but it's actually not true. As long as resistance training is delivered safely and effectively under appropriate care and supervision, it's a fantastic way for young people not only to develop their physical capabilities, but also to minimize risk of injury. For the fact that you are all obviously hopefully listening to this from Wales means I would really signpost you towards the work from Cardiff Met University, from Rodri Lloyd and John Oliver, around their work around young people's appropriate training. They're massive experts on this topic, and there's a video that you'll be able to find on the UK Coaching YouTube channel as well, explaining appropriate physical training capacities for young people. Excuse me. What I would say, as I said at the start though, technique is what's important to develop with young athletes here, not load. I really don't care what your squat or what your clean personal best is. I'm interested if you've got a really good technique. The truth is that anybody can go into the gym and get really strong and think that that's hard work. Believe me, it's not. In fact, what follows next is the real hard work, working on your mobility, working on your trunk strength. They are where the athletes really separate themselves, in my experience. And I would say as well, because obviously one of the reasons we're doing these webinars is because we've been in a lockdown situation and maybe not able to get access to things like a gym. But I would doubt that for many athletes, their limiting factor in their performance this year is going to be their access to strength training in a gym. Quite the opposite. In fact, I think it's given people an opportunity to look at different areas of training and maybe address other weaknesses or areas for development they hadn't had time to focus on as much in the past. So certainly resistance training, very important. I'm a huge fan of it, but don't always think it has to be in a gym. You can use medicine balls as a good example. You can use bands, you can use body weight. It doesn't have to all be about what somebody can squat or bench press. Next, to say around mobility, I'm a huge fan of that. If you have YouTube or you want to use YouTube, I do recommend go and look at some of the videos from Kelly Brammold and her Perform Mobility site. She's actually put together lots of really good mobility videos for javelin throwers that are free to access, and that's a great resource that's out there. It's free. Definitely get using that. Trunk strength, well, for me that's hugely important, because if we don't have the trunk strength, we're not able to block and transfer the energy into the throw. When people talk about the block in the javelin throw, quite often I feel that they think they're talking about just the front leg's ability to block and stay strong, but actually you need to think about the whole of the body blocking and staying strong to transfer energy into the throw. And then the final thing I said is throwing other things isn't illegal. With young developing athletes, have them throwing lots of different things. That's great, that's fun. Have them doing left-handed, have them doing right-handed, have them doing medicine balls, D-balls, throwing balls, discus, hammer, shot. It's all great. Get them out there throwing lots of different implements and enjoying themselves throwing. You don't need to focus on javelin too young. So my golden rules for, I think, really all athletic coaching here, but in particular for javelin coaches today are, first of all, make it fun. It has to be fun to make sure that the athletes keep coming back again. So that's the first thing I would always say. And that goes back to my previous point of, if you do have lots of technical information you want to get over in a session, perhaps it's worth just letting them scratch the itch first and have a few throws before we get into too much technical detail. Next up, make it development stage appropriate. So don't go and find something that an elite level athlete is doing on YouTube and then just go and blindly copy that. Whenever we bring over world-class coaches, they will always say the same thing, that their specific strength-based exercises, they don't really start working with athletes on those until they leave the under 23 age group. Well, the truth is we don't have enough high level throwers in this country that are still throwing at that age. So it's really important that we're not offering them age inappropriate training. I have, as I've mentioned before, the British #1 female javelin thrower that I coach at the moment, Becca, the many exercises that we just don't do yet because she's still only 20 years old and there's no rush to do that. So I certainly wouldn't be expecting 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds to be out there doing really specific strength work. Next thing to say is always keep it safe. And again, I don't just mean because the javelin is a weapon. I also mean just focus on the real basics sometimes, where We're keeping the arm up high enough to ensure nobody gets injured. We're going to make sure that the back isn't going to be stressed. Following that technical model that I explained in the middle of the workshop really does help you understand how you're going to keep athletes safe and protected. And quite simply, the technical model doesn't just make a javelin go further, it's also there to make sure that athletes are going to be safe and not get injured. Athlete first, thrower second, javelin thrower third. We always need to remember when we're coaching that we are dealing with the person in that order. So all javelin throwers should first and foremost be an athlete and then a thrower. We don't want to take young people at 10, 11, 12 years old and have them turning around and saying, I am a javelin thrower. In fact, quite the opposite. What I want them to do is be a really, really good athlete first, then move into maybe specializing in one particular event group area before we then focus on being a javelin thrower. And you know what? You don't need to be the best in the age group throughout to become a really good senior. In fact, quite the opposite. With things like relative age effect, where somebody might be bigger than another young person of the same age, we tend to find that those that are the best in the age group for under 15s, under 17s, they don't often go on to become the very best in the country or indeed the world at a later stage. It's much more important to have a star that burns brightly for a longer period of time. And in javelin throwing, as with all of the throws, we tend to find it's quite a late peaking event. So certainly the other side of 25 is when I'd be expecting athletes to really reach their peak. And the final thing to say is to avoid early elimination. So we talk a lot about early specialization and focusing too much on one particular event, but actually we now tend to find that the research is suggesting that early elimination, i.e. getting rid of other things, is one of the things we should truly avoid. So if a child is doing lots of different sports or they're doing lots of different events, that's fantastic. Don't feel the need to rush to get rid of those other events, those other activities too young, because it actually is much better for a young person's development over a long period of time. If I take, for example, Thomas Roller, he was a triple jumper until he reached the under 20 ranks in the javelin. And if you look at how effective he moves and the fact he's Olympic and European champion, it certainly hasn't done him any harm at all, has it? So those are my top tips. If anybody has any questions, I'm very, very happy to take those now. And the other thing I promised I would say as well is that as part of this Welsh Athletics webinar series, the next session is going to be on hammer, I think, around about a month's time. So if anybody has any questions, Ryan Spencer Jones is the person to ask on that. His email address, if you don't have it already, is ryan.spencer-jones@welshathletics.org. So if anybody has any questions, please do feel free to ask me those in the chat box and I will try and answer those for you now. And if we don't have any questions, of course, please feel free to go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Hopefully I've kept us pretty much perfectly to time. I have indeed. It's 5 to 8, so that's good news. And I've really enjoyed being able to present this today. Hopefully we'll be able to do something similar again in future, but please do ask me any questions you've got as you go along. If you are going now, please do remember that hammer session and remember Ryan Spencer Jones to ask any questions to if you do want to attend that next session. Questions coming in here from Michael. Do you have any tips for throws analysis, i.e. what software to use? Yes, so I actually am a big fan of using an app called Coach's Eye. I think it's really good to make sure that not only are we able to look at slow motion in our videos, but we're also able to share those with the athletes as well, so they have a greater understanding of how to understand the event, what they're working on, what they're not working on. And crucially, they're able to then tell me what they feel about things and what they see. So I'm a big fan of making sure that athletes become students of the event themselves. So yeah, Coach's Eye is one I'm a big fan of. Another reason I really like Coach's Eye is it gives me an opportunity to compare two videos side to side. And that's a really good way then for athletes to be able to see maybe the difference between a training throw and a competition throw, or perhaps between their training throw and a elite athlete's training throw if they wanted to look at maybe areas for development. No problems. Thanks, Michael. I think I've got one other question coming in as well from Michael. Any tips for creating a training plan? Any resources out there, particularly as junior athletes develop? Yes, so in terms of creating a training program, I think the most important thing to do is plan out exactly what that young person is going to be doing through their week. And bear in mind that needs to include, with those that are still at school, anything they might be doing in terms of PE or extracurricular sport at school, and also any other sports or clubs that they're part of as well. Because one thing I wouldn't want to do as a coach is, first of all, duplicate something they might be doing elsewhere, or secondly, get them to a point where I'm overtraining them and trying to ask too much of them. So what would I go back to as being the absolute key points? Well, I'm going to split up my week. So for me, I tend to have javelin throwers throw twice a week. Now, I know with hammer throwers, they can throw, blimey, up to every day or even twice a day sometimes. But with javelin, I think 2, maximum of 3 sessions a week is all that's really needed. So the first thing I always do is plan where those javelin sessions are going to be, and then I plan the key elements of rest around that. Then secondly, if we have an athlete that's doing strength training, I'll look at where that needs to fit in. And what I'm looking to do is minimize the type of training that's more likely to create soreness that's going to affect their throwing, their technical sessions. Because athletes don't want to turn up for their throw sessions tired and sore wherever possible. They certainly don't want to be feeling like they're not quite at 100% before they throw. So that's the next thing I would do. Some of the things that do tend to create more of the soreness and stiffness is when we're doing plyometric sessions, maybe sometimes sprints or some weightlifting sessions, particularly when I think about maybe if a new block of training where you're introducing a new exercise or one they haven't done for a while, that's more likely to create some soreness and stiffness. In fact, one of my athletes is going back into the gym for the first time in 3 months tomorrow, so I think she'll be quite sore once we get through to Wednesday. So planning to avoid, from my perspective anyway, planning to avoid soreness wherever possible with when throwing days are likely to occur is a really big important factor. And then, as I said, making sure we're fitting that around anything the athlete might already be doing. In terms of any resources that are out there, well, to be honest with you, I'm quite happy for you to email me and I'll send you some of the things that I've got. My email address, if people don't have it, is d.turner@lboro.ac.uk. And I'm happy to share with you some of the things that I'm doing with athletes. But also there are some resources. If you have a look out there online, you'll see that there are everything from an annual plan, which, to be perfectly honest, at development stage, I don't really think an annual plan is essential for you at this stage. But what it is really important to do is make sure you have those monthly plans, whether it be 3, 4, 5 week blocks, whatever it is that you like as your mesocycle. Make sure you have those in place, because not just for you to know where you're going to be as a coach, but also for athletes and parents as well to be able to plan around things. And I think it helps them to do everything from not only planning their social life and activities, but also as well things like when they know they've got a hard session, they should be able to be thinking about what type of food is going to be appropriate for pre-session and for recovery. Great. Any more questions before I finish off? It looks like that's all the questions. So pretty much, yeah, bang on 8 o'clock. Kept it to an hour perfectly. So hopefully that's been useful. Again, if you do have any questions that pop into your mind after the session, please feel free to send them through to Ryan, and he'll make sure that they come to me and I'll be able to give you an answer, or feel free to come to me directly as well with my email address. So one more question that's come through. Do you do any javelin camps? Yes, we actually do run javelin camps in Loughborough. Unfortunately, due to last winter, the fact that the Para World Championships were so late in the year in November, meant that we weren't able to run one because I was over in Dubai with the GB Para team. And by the time we got back, it was too close to Christmas. And then, of course, after Christmas, we got hit by COVID. So we will be hopefully running more camps in the future, either run by myself and some of the coaches that I work with nationally. And also, we tend to bring in some famous people as well to help out. So in the past, we've brought in the former Finnish national coach, Kimmo Kinnunen, who was 1991 world champion. Thomas Roller has come over. And certainly Mike Barber and Kelsey Lee Barber are looking to come over as well next year as part of their training base in Europe as well. So definitely be happy to run some more camps as well going forward. One more question. What would your response be to an athlete who you would have talked through athlete first, thrower second, and their parents just wanted them to throw? Yeah, great question. Essentially the way that I see it is that if you want to be coached by me, you need to fit into my philosophy as much as I need to fit into making sure I'm coaching you as an individual. And if you're looking for a coach that tells you that that's fine, you go off and be the best 16-year-old javelin thrower that you can possibly be, then I'm probably not going to be the right coach for you. My job as I see it is to make sure an athlete is the best they can possibly be when they leave the under 23 ranks. So if I'm working with a 17-year-old, as I am at the moment, who's won the English schools or as maybe being a junior international, then one thing I do need to do is make sure that they have to listen and follow the progress and the process that we have in order to be able to have the long-term success they're looking for. And I think what's absolutely crucial there is that's not just me saying that. There might be other coaches, other people within a team that they're working with. It might be a club official, but it's very likely to be the parents as well that I need to impress that information on. So yeah, make sure that you're communicating with athletes, with their team, to make sure that they all understand that long-term success is what's really key. And if you don't believe me, then there's lots and lots of research out there on the internet that explains all about how it's much better for athletes in power sports, of which javelin is one, to not specialize and not eliminate other sports and events too early. I like to think of javelin as well as being probably similar to maybe triple jump than it is to shot put. So in terms of training, first of all, javelin has a run to it, which you can't say that the other throws have. That's something that needs to be taken into account. And the answers for that, therefore, are not all in the weights room, as I keep going back to. So yes, strength training, resistance training, hugely important, but certainly being able to run, to be able to do plyometric exercise as well, to have that hip, ankle, knee stability, shoulder stability, appropriate mobility, all essential to be able to become a really good javelin thrower one day. And it's much better to lay the foundations now with young people than it is to try and address weaknesses, try and address injuries and rehabilitation later on. Okay, I think I've got all the questions done. If I haven't done, then as I said, please do feel free to send them through to Ryan or to myself, and have a really good evening. And thanks for attending, everyone.